Welcome back to the weekly webinars by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service in Bexar County. This week I'm going to be talking about the fall warm weather vegetable garden pests that you're going to be experiencing. In the state of Texas, we can say that fall comes in two temperatures. It's hot or it's warm. So this is the warmer, hotter weather type vegetables that you'll be growing during this portion of fall. My name is Molly Keck. I am an Integrated Pest Management Program Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service in Bexar County. So your fall warm weather veggies are not going to be all of the cool weather veggies that you might be thinking of planting for your fall garden. Instead, right now we're in August, and these are things that you're going to be planting in August that will be readily available for you September and October. We're really not going to get much cooler until we get into October, November, and even December. So we almost have two different seasons in the fall for your vegetables. So to give you a recap of what David talked about in his getting your garden ready for fall veggies, you can grow your fall tomatoes. Peppers are still going to be warm enough to be able to plant. Squash and zucchini are also available. Okra is another one. It's still warm enough that okra is out. And your southern peas. So those are your main 5 or so vegetables that you'll be able to grow during the hotter times of this early part of fall / late part of the summertime. Now, some of those non-chemical control measures that you can try to use, if you don't want to use pesticides and you want to try to do some preventive measures, there are non-chemical control measures. The biggest one being that you have to control the weeds in and around your garden. If you don't do that, you're going to encourage all sorts of pests that want to be there and will then move into your vegetable garden. Also use sharp blasts of water. This will help dislodge, break off body parts of some of your softer bodied insects. It will remove eggs and it will kill some of those immatures that are very soft bodied also. And then anything that likes to grow as a vine, if you allow it some sort of a trellis to be able to grow as a vine, you produce less surface area where insects can hide associated with the soil, and you give that plant a way to grow up and off of the ground and less places for the insects to be hiding out. Also, I just want to draw your attention to the difference between chewing and sucking insect damage. So a chewing insect is going to make actual holes in the plants, whereas an insect that has sucking mouth parts is going to form kind of a wilted or deformed look on the leaves. So know the difference between the two, and that helps you kind of narrow down who might be doing the damage on your plants and gives you a better idea of how to manage them or give you a game plan for how to control them. Tomato pests include hornworms, stink bugs, pinworms, and there's a number of others that will get on them, including spider mites, which we'll talk about in a moment. But I'll just remind you that August 12th, we're doing a webinar on tomato veggie pests, specifically on the vegetable pests or on the insect pests on your tomato plants. So if you're interested in learning more about that and all the specifics of these insects that can do damage to it, be able to check out that webinar or come back to this YouTube channel after August 12th to watch that. So let's just talk about a couple of the insects that cause damage on your tomato plants, and that's the main one being a leaf-footed bug. This is kind of your arch nemesis if you're growing tomato plants. They are a true bug that is sucking the sap out of the leaves, but they will also do damage to the fruit of the tomato. So you will get like a dead spot or a rotten spot that just rots away at the tomato, or you might have a hard spot that's lighter in color, and usually that makes the tomato taste very bitter. So either way, when they feed on these tomatoes, you're not able to get the fruit from it, the yield from it that you want. It's not really edible. My best suggestion is to find the immatures. Watch your tomato plants as they're starting to produce tomatoes and keep an eye out for those young immatures. They are red with black long legs. They kind of look like spiders. When they become adults, they're very hard-bodied and they're mobile and able to move out of the way of whatever you apply. So try to catch them when they're young. Go outside with some sort of a pan, a shallow dish pan, a cookie sheet, something like that, or even a cup. Fill it with some rubbing alcohol and flick the tomato leaf and allow them all to fall off into the pan or the cup. Or beat the plant gently. Beat it, give it a good jarring motion so that all of the insects drop off of it. But when they fall in that rubbing alcohol, you've killed them all. So you've just killed 25, 30 insects without having to utilize any pesticides or apply anything to the plant. You can also try to hand pick them off. You can purchase bug suckers, little vacuums that will suck them off of the plant also. And you can try to use some pesticides, synthetic pyrethroids like bifenthrin, permethrin, cyfluthrin. These are the thrins. At the end of the word, you notice that there's a thrin. You just need to be very careful and cognizant and make sure that you are using something that is labeled specifically for vegetable plants. If it's not labeled for vegetable plants, don't use it on your vegetables. The main pest of your squash and your zucchini in the fall are going to be cucumber beetles, squash bugs, and squash vine borers. And these are kind of listed in order of what happens as soon as that plant starts to develop onto when it becomes a more established plant. So cucumber beetles are leaf feeders, and they come in a variety of different forms. You have banded, spotted, and striped. They tend to scrape on the fruit, and they're hardest on your young seedlings. So if you're going from seed and those young cotyledons are popping up, you have these young little seedlings, that's when they're going to come in and really cause some damage on those plants. Once they become established, your plant can generally outgrow the damage that they do. So where you really want to be mostly concerned is when they're feeding on your very, very young transplants. Typical cucumber damage is holes, small holes in the leaves of your plants, making it to where they've never gotten to the point where they could flower because they are putting so much energy into fixing those leaves. You'll see several of them on one single leaf. There's lots of them, and they're flitting around and flying around all over the place. They will lay their eggs in the soil around the plants. So one of the ways to try to prevent them from doing that is to use some sort of mulch. A good straw mulch will make it so that they don't want to lay their eggs there. They want to lay their eggs in soil. So now they're laying further away and saving your plant. It's more distance for them to go. You can also try to use a reflective plastic. Also, I would recommend that if you have an issue with cucumber beetles, if you had a big problem with them in the springtime, you probably don't want to plant your cucumbers. You probably don't want to plant your squash or your zucchini in that same garden bed. Switch it around so that those eggs that do hatch out don't have food right there for them to just feed on. You also might consider not growing squash or zucchini in the fall if you had a major problem with these guys during the spring and summer season. If they do start to cause some damage, you might want to pull up those seedlings and use a transplant that's a little bit larger. This way it's able to outgrow the damage and the feeding that the cucumber beetles can do. You may also want to utilize floating row covers. This keeps the beetles from getting in there, but this plant isn't at the point where it wants to flower just yet, so it can be an effective form of control. And then if you must utilize some insecticides, spinosad, neem, pyrethrum, those will give you some short-term relief. And that may be all that you need for the population density that you have. But if you need something that's a little bit longer residual, carbaryl and permethrin. These are good products that you can use early on in the season before your zucchini and your squash have bloomed, so you're not accidentally affecting your pollinators. Squash vine borers are very aggravating for most of us as gardeners because once they come in, there's really not much that we can do about it. This is an orange and grayish blue moth that will come in and lay their eggs on the vines of different cucurbits, and they will start to burrow. The larvae will then burrow through the vine and eventually kill the entire plant. Once that starts, you can't stop it. The whole plant is going to die, unfortunately, and you have zero yield out of that plant. They generally emerge as the adult in the spring and start laying eggs with our spring vine plants like squash and zucchini, but we have multiple generations a year, so we will have them throughout the fall, and they will cause damage and lay their eggs in other vine plants like your pumpkins, your squash, zucchini, etc. One great way to determine if it's time to treat or if they're around your plants is to utilize some squash vine borer pheromone traps or pheromone lures. And they look to me like the end of a pencil. On that little rubber piece right there is a lure that makes the males think a female is there. And so this gives you an idea of how the population is in your area. So if you get a specific squash vine borer pheromone lure, you're able to determine when they're active and when it's a good time to be treating. You can find these lures on Arbico, you can find them on Amazon, you can find them through many other suppliers. My recommendation is just Google it, put in a Google search, and you're very likely to find yourself some sort of a pheromone trap. So physical things that you can do to try to manage the squash vine borers, non-chemical, would be to put some foil around the vines when you notice that the adults are active. So when you found them in your pheromone traps, the pheromone traps just tell you when they're there, right? So they are coming to it because they're ready to mate and they're ready to lay eggs on the vines. So you can put foil around the vines so that they can't lay their eggs there. You can use floating row covers, but generally your plant is flowering, and so then it's not going to go through pollination, and then you're not going to have the squash or the zucchini. So treat the vines 1 week after you find the adults, because that's about the time they're mating and laying their eggs. These eggs will hatch after about a week and burrow through the vine. You can also, if you cannot find the pheromone traps or you prefer not to use the lures, use the yellow pan method for monitoring. And that's where you just basically put out bowls of yellow with some soapy water, and they are attracted to it and they'll fall in it. This is not as effective as using the pheromone lures, however, but it's something that you could try to do. Your different options for controlling these guys are really going to depend on how long of a residual you want, but also on how accurate you are on determining if they are around. So if you're using the lures and you don't care if you have a long residual, then you can use BT or spinosad, both of which are organic options. They will give you 1 week or less of a residual. So read the label, determine how often you need to reapply. Remember, you're really only applying to the vine, so you don't have to spray on your flowers and you don't have to spray all over the leaves. You're utilizing just the vines because that's where they want to land and lay their eggs. And what's happening is when the egg is laid, it's not killing the moths. When the egg is laid and they hatch and they're chewing through the vine, you are killing that little caterpillar that's doing the chewing through. And so you're preventing them from getting to the point where they start to burrow into the vine or through the vine. So you're trying to catch them as they're chewing through. So they're dead or dying by the time they make it to the inside, if they even make it that far. Your carbaryl products will give you about 10 days to 14, so about 2 weeks or so of a residual. Permethrin and bifenthrin products can give you up to 4 weeks. This is going to vary depending on how much sunlight and how hot and how well you apply the product and how much rain and how you're watering. If you have drip irrigation, then this is going to allow you to have a little bit longer residual, whereas if you're spraying over the plant or pouring water over the plant, then you might be washing that off. And then what has the longest residual is S-phenvalerate, and this is something that may not be so easy to find at your local nursery, but you can certainly find products online. You just want to make sure that you purchase what is appropriate for a vegetable and not something that you would use for trees and shrubs or ornamental plants. Those are going to be a different percentage, and you want to make sure you use the right product on the right plant. Squash bugs will come in a little bit later in the season, usually around the same time as the squash vine borers. And initially, what you'll notice are some yellow flecks on the foliage that will later start to turn brown. And then they continue to reproduce, and they do this to the entire plant. So as soon as you start to get a good amount of leaves, this is when you'll start to notice that you have squash bugs. Later on, the foliage will completely wilt and it will eventually die, and they will start to feed on the fruit and cause wounds on the fruit. And these guys will also do damage to pumpkins as well as squash and zucchini. Notice though that there is a difference between squash bug damage and powdery mildew. Squash bugs have a yellowing look to them. It almost looks like you overwatered, whereas powdery mildew is white, right? And this is caused by a number of different funguses. A fungicide is how you would manage that issue. Squash bugs are going to be a little bit different. However, it is not uncommon to have powdery mildew plus other insect issues happening to plants because the plant is stressed out and it's encouraging insects to come to it and feed on it. For squash bug management, because these squash bugs love when they're not feeding to crawl down to the base of the plant where it touches the soil, if you provide a lot of mulch, then this will give them more hiding places to hang out when they're not feeding on the plant. So avoid mulch with your squash and your zucchini. Mulch is good though with your if you're dealing with cucumber beetles. So you might have to decide what time of year you want to put that mulch out and if you want to pull it away when the squash bugs become noticeable. Use pesticides early on in the season as opposed to waiting until you see a lot of damage. And one good place to apply those pesticides are at the base of the plant where they like to congregate, so you get a little bit more bang for your buck and you're not applying pesticides to the entire plant. When the population gets very big, then you can apply it to the entire plant. So S-fenvalerate, permethrin, and carbaryl are good options. These are really just contact pesticides, so you want to try to touch as much of the actual insects as possible. You can also certainly hand pick them off, though, if they're easy for you to catch. And then make sure that you destroy your crop residuals and you turn your beds over. So if you planted some zucchini or some summer squash and you're now going to be planting your fall or winter squash, make sure that you turn that soil over. Make sure that you totally pull that crop out. Don't allow that crop to just die off on its own, because that will draw more insects to it. So pull it up when it's done. Pull it up as soon as you can and completely destroy it. Bag it up and throw it in the trash can. We love to grow our peppers through the fall also when we get into the dog days of summer into August and September. And peppers love to get certain insects on them, one of those being spider mites, which are a heat-loving pest that you will find on lots of other of these vegetables that we have discussed. The other one that peppers will get are cutworms. And cutworms also will get on your zucchini, so they're not just only on your peppers, but they're not specific to any vegetables, so you might find them even on tomatoes and other plants. They're hardest on the seedlings and very young transplants where you have a very thin and very soft stem. So they are called a cutworm because they will come along and feed on the stem and just cut it off from the soil. And if you're seeing that on your plants, this is what you've got. Usually when you dig around in the soil, they're almost grub-like and they're curled up into a C or a circle. That's how you know that you have cutworms around. When you find those, pull them up, smash them, step on them. To control the cutworms, make sure that you water well to promote quicker growth of the plant. You want to do things to make the plant grow faster and become stronger so that the cutworms can't do anything about it. These are generally evening feeders and into the night, so you want to apply your pesticides early evening, which is a good practice anyway because that's when your pollinators are not out pollinating. And you can use aluminum or cardboard collars or rings around the base of the plant so they can't grab onto anything to feed on it. And then you're treating the plant with carbaryl, lambda-cyhalothrin. Those are two good options. And looking around in the soil, digging through the soil and hand-picking the ones that you can find. Since these are caterpillars, you can try BT or even spinosad, but these are going to give you less control, significantly less control than the carbaryl or 7 products or your permethrin type products. Spider mites are a heat-loving pest, and so as we get into the dog days of summer and we're in July, you start to plant your plants in August, they will start to thrive. Things that are very hot and are ready to be pulled are going to encourage tons of spider mites. So I hear a lot of people saying, well, I'm still getting some tomatoes off of my plants. If they're not looking so hot, if they seem to be wilting and they're not producing a whole lot of leaves, I would highly encourage that you remove those old vegetable plants from your garden so that you don't encourage tons of spider mites from reproducing and taking over the beds. You will find that 1 or 2 extra tomatoes this season is going to equal 0 tomatoes in the fall because the spider mites are not going to allow your tomatoes to do much. So these are heat-loving mite, and they thrive. The hotter it is, the more they reproduce, and they love to get on peppers, tomatoes, and even your southern peas. One way to control these is to do some plant washing. So that's get your hands soapy and wash those leaves and try to physically remove them off of it. But because they thrive where it's hot, do things to decrease the temperature somehow. That could be watering a little bit more, which allows you to decrease the soil temperature, and so it radiates up and it's a little bit cooler on the plant. Provide some sort of an artificial shade, mesh screen, so that you can still get the sunlight to come through. If you're growing in a greenhouse, increase the airflow in some way because they will thrive when there's crowded conditions and the airflow is very stagnant. And then insecticidal soaps, summer oils at the summer oil rate, sulfur can be effective against spider mites. Marigolds are also a very good indicator crop. So plant your marigolds around your vegetable garden, but know that you have got to treat your marigolds for for spider mites, because you're going to draw them to the marigolds and then you nuke the heck out of the marigolds so that you don't have issues in your vegetables. And what's nice about using your marigolds for that reason is that you have a lot of other options as far as treatment goes, because you're probably not eating those marigolds. If you are, make sure you're using products that are used on plants that are consumable. Acephate and bifenthrin are great options for spider mites, but may not be available on a vegetable plant in the formulation that you want. So you can use those on your marigolds instead. I would just highly encourage you to make sure that you are purchasing something that says mites on the label, and do a little research and determine that you're getting something that is meant for mites, because these are not insects. So many of our insecticides are not going to work as well on our mites. You want a miticide. Okra is a plant that we are going to see through the hotter times of the fall. They're still going to be producing. It's the season for them right now. So you want to look out for a couple different pests that will come on them, and those are ants and aphids mainly, but spider mites will get on them as well. Ants and aphids almost always come hand in hand. And you can see on this plant, there's a couple different types of aphids. I see some greenish colored aphids, and then I see some that are more yellow in color. They come in a variety of different colors. So just because they're not the color that you recognize doesn't necessarily mean you don't have aphids. Aphids are very soft-bodied. You can see the shed skin that they've left behind because they are pretty much immobile and they really don't leave the plant. They will just kind of crawl around the plant. Usually when you have ants running up and down your okra plant, they are tending to the aphids. Certain ants, like especially fire ants, will feed on that greasy inside of the okra. So determine what type of species of ant you have. One easy way is to let a fire ant sting you. If it stings and forms a little pustule, you know you've got fire ants. If they don't want to sting you, then you probably have another species of ant. So for fire ants, use something that is a fire ant bait. This is effective and really specific to fire ants. It may not be very effective against non-fire ant species. Amdro Ant Block is a great option for your non-fire ant species because it contains a couple different attractants, so it can get many different species of ants. But if you've got fire ants, use the fire ant bait. Come and Get It with Spinosad is an organic option, and it is the only option that I'm aware of where you can place it inside of the veggie garden. The others must be sprinkled along the outside. They'll go out and they'll forage and they'll pick it up. But here's the trick. If you have aphids on your plant and you have an issue with ants, they are going after the aphids because the aphids are producing a substance that they're feeding on. They're tending to the aphids and they're feeding on them. So if you do not manage the aphids, which are producing their primary food source, their preferred food source, then you're not going to be able to get the ants to come to the baits. You may or may not find the mound to be able to treat the mound, so baits are a better option for you. Aphids are very common when you have overcrowded, poor air circulation, super humid conditions. It's just hot, and so they're going to thrive. If you're overwatering and producing extra humidity, you may also end up with aphids as well. We also see them when the plant is coming near to the end of its life, so consider how long has that plant been in the ground? Is it time to get rid of it? Aphids are not just found on okra. They are commonly found on zucchini, but you can also see them on pretty much any species of plant. There's probably an aphid species that will feed on it. To control your aphids, they're pretty wimpy and easy to manage, but the issue is that you need to get on a regimen and treat them often. If you don't do that, then you actually make them want to fill the space. They reproduce extra to try to fill up the space of all the aphids that you killed. So you can apply some product and then come back 2 weeks later and it might look like you have more aphids than when you started. And that is not an uncommon thing to see. So get on a regimen. It's going to take probably multiple treatments. Don't just treat when it looks like the aphids are getting bad. Treat when you see them, and treat regularly. Read the label and see how often you should apply the pesticide. So soaps and oils work great for them. Anything that's labeled for that plant will work fairly well for them. Of course, soaps and oils will give you a very short residual, and you can go out there and treat probably a couple days later. Be real careful with the soaps and oils and anything else that's oil-based so that you don't get a leaf burn in these hot times of the year. Heavy water sprays can also be pretty effective, and that's where you're just busting them to pieces. You can do that multiple times a day, but again, you have to do it often so that you reduce the population and continue to reduce it instead of reduce it for a moment and then they ramp up reproduction to fill the space that you knocked off. Another plant that we like to plant in the warm parts of the fall are our southern peas. And you can often get Mexican bean beetles that will cause some issues with them. And also spider mites will get on your southern peas and cause some damage. A Mexican bean beetle is very interesting because it does very much resemble a ladybug. It is actually related to ladybugs. It's in the Coccinellidae family, which ladybugs are also. So they have the same shape to them. They have the spotting on their back. They're a little bit more of a muted orange or yellowish in color, faded, as opposed to a more vibrant orange or red that the ladybug is. And their larvae look very weird. They look like very spiky, odd little larvae. And the damage that they do is chewing on and scraping on the leaves, eventually forming holes throughout the leaves, and just really causing a lot of damage to the leaves. When there's damage on the leaves, the rest of the plant can't do the job that it's meant to do. You can find Mexican bean beetle eggs. They look similar to ladybug eggs. If you're finding them on bean plants, then obviously you're probably dealing with the Mexican bean beetle. So management for these guys is first and foremost, as you're deciding what to plant right now, choose varieties that are more resistant to the bean beetle. Lima bean is resistant to them, but really who wants to plant that? But do some research and decide if there are varieties of the type of bean that you're looking for that may not have a lot of these bean beetles attracted to it. Also, you can use floating row covers after you plant. You can hand crush those eggs and those larvae if you're spending a lot of time in watching those plants very closely. And you can utilize certain pesticides. Spinosad, neem, and pyrethrum are all organic options, and they can be pretty effective against the bean beetle. You may have to have multiple treatments, though, depending on how many eggs they've laid, because when those eggs hatch, you kind of have a second generation that's emerging. And then there's just some general pests that we'll see in the fall time. This is summer of 2020 right now, and grasshoppers this year are all over the place. So it might be a season or a year when we don't see a lot of grasshoppers, but in some years we have more than others, and this seems to be one of those years in 2020. Grasshoppers feed on the leaves. They're generalist feeders of pretty much anything, but vegetables are tasty. They are soft. They are easy for them to consume. They're very tender, and so they're going to be very much attracted to them. This time of the year, later on in the summer, it's too late to do anything as far as no-low baits or any of the other baits to try to manage the young. Instead, what you've got to do is try to control the adults who are coming up and who are feeding. So carbaryl, permethrin, and acephate are good options. They give you a little bit longer residual. If the plants aren't blooming, then you can use some sort of a row cover. Grasshoppers are very difficult to manage because they're extremely mobile. So you're going to have to use more potent pesticides with a longer residual so that you hope that they consume enough of it to get sick and die. Another generalist pest that we tend to see in the fall are whiteflies, and this is usually in the later part of the fall because we tend to get a little bit more rain. They're very common when we have high moisture or high humidity and the temperatures start to drop off a little bit and get a little bit cooler. So you may not see it in August or even early September, but you certainly will see it a little bit later on in the season. These whiteflies are small flies. You can see what the larvae or the nymphs look like there on the plant, and you can actually see some young nymphs and maybe even some eggs there over on the left hand side of the screen. When you knock the plant, they'll flutter away and they fly off. You can use a couple different things. Reflective mulches, they're not attracted to it. This will keep leafhoppers and other things from coming to those plants as well. So reflective mulches tend to work well, or some sort of a reflective substrate that you would place on the ground around the plants, sheet or something like that, so that they're not coming to the plant. Weed management is incredibly important. Whiteflies love weeds, and so if you can control those, you can control the whiteflies. And then you can also use yellow sticky traps. So yellow sticky traps are something that the whiteflies are attracted to, and they'll get stuck to it, as opposed to using a white sticky trap, but also you can't really see them on the white background, or even a blue sticky trap. So place out yellow sticky traps for monitoring to see when the populations are high enough, and that tells you, oh, I've got a lot of whiteflies, I better start treating. But you notice by the picture there, you'll also find that you will catch a lot of other things on those sticky traps. And then some people will paint yellow stakes and put them in the ground, paint them bright yellow like that, and apply some petroleum jelly around it, and so when they are attracted to it, they get stuck to it. You could also use a sticky substance like Tanglefoot and do the same type thing, but that way you can use that stake over and over and over again throughout the season instead of purchasing new sticky traps all the time. To control the whiteflies, neems, soaps, and oils can be effective, but you have to directly spray them with it. So you have to make sure that you're applying underneath the leaf in some way, if at all possible. Otherwise, it's not going to be effective. The whiteflies are underneath as opposed to hanging out on top. Most of the products that you're going to use have to be directly sprayed, especially for a vegetable plant, because whiteflies are sap suckers. So they're not really taking chunks of the plant out. So you have to really apply it directly to their body for it to do a whole lot for them. And then also just sharp blasts of water, physical plant washing, doing things to physically break them up and remove them and reduce that population. But you have to get on that, on a regimen doing that, and do that very often if you actually want to see long-term results from it. Just a little word about our pollinators. Make sure that you know when your pollinators are out looking for food, and don't apply pesticides when the pollinators are present. The best time to treat is really in the evening when they've all gone back to bed, because that allows your plants or your pesticide to dry, and it then makes it less likely that your pollinators will encounter it. Remember, they're going after the flowers, so if you can avoid the flowers, then you're not going to kill your bumblebees and your honeybees and your other pollinators that are coming after your plants. Don't just think that if you're using organic pesticides that they're not going to kill your pollinators. It's still a pesticide. It's still an insecticide, and insecticides kill insects. Pollinators are insects too. So whatever it is that you use, just make sure that you don't apply. Be smart, but don't do it when the pollinators are present. If your plant doesn't need it, don't do it preemptively. If it's flowering like crazy and the pollinators are all over it, it's probably just fine. Make some considerations about your pollinators when you're utilizing pesticides. Make sure that you check out all of our other webinars on our My Extension YouTube channel. We have tons of them up online and available for you to peruse and watch and go back and listen to in case you have questions about gardening or pest management. Thanks for joining me for this week's weekly webinar. We'll see you for others. Make sure that you check them out on our YouTube channel, My Extension 210.